Before Jack the Ripper, there was Austin. 4 years before London's East End became the most infamous murder scene in history, a killer walked the streets of Austin, Texas, and did something that no documented killer in American history has ever done before. He killed in a pattern, same method, same type of victim, same time of night, same signature left at every skin. 8 attacks over the course of 1 year. 8 women dragged from their beds in the dark, struck with an axe or a long metal spike while they slept, mutilated, left in yards, in alleys, in the mud. 7 of them died. The city panicked. Police were baffled. Suspects were arrested and released. Theories multiplied, and the killer, whoever he was, walked among the cities of Austin every single day, completely undetected. He was never caught. He was never identified. But here is a detail that has followed this case for 140 years. The one that historians and true crime researchers keep returning to, that nobody has ever been able to definitely rule out. In 1884 and 1885, while these murders were happening, a young man was living in Austin, working odd jobs, getting into trouble, spending his evenings in bars, his afternoons wandering the city. He knew the neighborhoods where the victims lived. He fit the rough description. Witnesses gave of a man seen near several crime scenes. He left Austin in 1885, shortly after the murder stopped, and he went on to become one of the most beloved short story writers in America, literally history. His name was William Cindy Porter. The world knew him as O. Henry. I will come back to him, I promise. But first, let me take you to the night it started, to a cold December evening in 1884, to a servant's quarter behind the house on West Pecan Street. December 30th, 1884. Molly Smith was 25 years old. She worked as a domestic servant for a family named Hall on West Pecan Street in Austin. Like most servants of the era, particularly black women in post-Reconstruction Texas, she lived in a small outbuilding behind the main house, a one-room structure, a bed, maybe a chair, a small stove. She shared the space with her boyfriend, Walter Spencer. Sometime in the early hours of December 31st, someone entered that room. Walter Spencer later said he was struck on the head and lost consciousness. When he came to, Molly was gone. They found Molly in the yard near the alley. She had been dragged from her bed, struck multiple times, and left in the mud and frost. She was still alive when they found her, barely. She died before morning. The whole family was horrified. Neighbors were frightened. Police investigated, found no clear suspect, and the case stopped almost immediately. The city moved on. It was New Year's Eve after all, and whoever had done this moved on too. Back into Austin, back into whatever ordinary life they lived. They wouldn't surface again for 3 months, but when they did, the same pattern could become impossible to ignore. Austin in 1884 was a city in transition. The state capitol building was under construction. The city had roughly 11,000 residents, gas lighting on the main streets, but the neighborhoods where servants lived, the back alleys, the outbuildings, the edges of the city were dark, genuinely, completely dark. The social structure was rigid. The majority of domestic servants in Austin were black women, descendants of enslaved people, living in the homes and outbuildings of white families, working for wages that barely sustained them, with almost no institutional protection. When Molly Smith was killed, the investigation lasted days before going cold. That invisibility, the erection of black women's safety as a public priority, could give the killer cover for months. He knew who was vulnerable, he chose accordingly, and he was disciplined about it, patient, methodical in a way that investigators simply hadn't encountered before and didn't have the language to describe. This was not rage, this was not impulse, this was a system. May 6, 1885, Eliza Shelley, a cook, found in her servants' quarters, skull fractured, and ear nearly severed by what investigators concluded was a long, sharp implement, possibly an axe, possibly a spike, attacked while she slept, dragged outside. She survived, barely. She could not identify her attacker. 3 weeks later, May 23, 1885, Irene Cross, another servant, same method, attacked in the night, dragged from her bed, left in the yard. She survived. Then came August and everything changed. August 31st, 1885, Rebecca Ramey and her daughter Mary, 11 years old, were attacked in their servants' quarter. Rebecca survived with severe head wounds. Mary did not, an 11-year-old child. Austin could no longer look away. The newspapers exploded. Citizens formed vigilance committees. Politicians demanded actions. The police chief came under intense public pressure, and the killer, apparently energized by the attention, accelerated. September 28, 1885, Grace Vance and Orange Washington, both servants, attacked at a residence on West 6th Street. Orange survived. Grace did not. The city was in open panic. Families dismissed their servants. Servants barricaded their doors. Men took turns standing watch. And still nothing. No arrest. No suspect. Nothing. Then came Christmas Eve. For the first time, he didn't target servants in outbuildings. For the first time, he went inside. Susan Hancock was a white woman, the wife of a respected Austin citizen named Moses Hancock. She was asleep in her own bed, in her own home, with her husband sleeping beside her. The killer entered the house, struck Moses on the head, rendering him unconscious, dragged Susan from the bed, through the house, and out the back door into the yard. Moses woke up covered in blood, his wife gone. He staggered outside and found her. She was alive. For a few hours, she died before morning. On the same night, Willa Phillips was attacked in a similar manner, dragged from her bed, left in the yard. She died. 2 women, one night, both inside their homes. The entire city understood in an instant. The servants' quarters had been a preference, not a limitation. Nowhere was safe. Moses Hancock was arrested because, in the absence of any other suspect, investigators did what investigators sometimes do. They look at the person closest to the victim. He was tried for the murder of his wife. He was acquitted because he hadn't done it, and the real killer was still out there. After Christmas Eve 1885, the attacks stopped. Just like that, the city slowly, tentatively exhaled, and investigators were left without nothing but questions. 8 attacks, 7 dead, a year of terror, and no arrest, no conviction, no explanation for why it started or why it stopped. Police had investigated dozens of suspects. They had arrested and released black men, white men, drifters, workers, neighbors. They had followed rumors. They had investigated family members of victims. Nothing held. When Jack the Ripper began his murders in London in 1888, journalists, including some in Austin, made an observation that was noted and then largely forgotten. The Ripper's method bore a striking resemblance to the Austin murders. Similar victim profiles, similar injuries, similar time of night, similar apparent knowledge of local geography. Scotland Yard actually sent an inquiry to Austin police. They were genuinely considering whether the same person might be responsible. A killer who had operated in Texas, then crossed the Atlantic. The inquiry went nowhere, but it planted a seed that researchers had been watering for over a decade, over a century. William Cindy Porter arrived in Austin in 1882. He was 20 years old, from Greensboro, North Carolina. He stayed. He worked a series of jobs: range hand, pharmacist assistant, draftsman, bank teller. He was charming, sociable, known around Austin bars and social circles. He had a gift for observation, for capturing the way people spoke and moved and talked. That gift could eventually make him famous, but in 1884 and 1885, he was just a young man living in Austin. He was in Austin during the murder year. He knew the neighborhoods. He frequented the same streets that could have given him knowledge of where servants lived and worked. He was a bright age, early 20s, described by acquaintances as physically capable, light on his feet. He left Austin in 1885, the same year the murders stopped. He eventually ended up in prison, not for murder, not for embezzlement from the bank where he worked. In prison, he began writing short stories published under a pen name he invented there, O. Henry. He was released in 1901 and moved to New York, where he became one of the most celebrated short story writers in American history. Warm, ironic, humane, he wrote about ordinary people, servants, working men and women, the urban poor, with apparent compassion. The theory connecting him to the Austin murders has been raised and re-raised by researchers for decades. The evidence is circumstantial, all of it: the timing, the geography, the physical description for one witness near a crime scene. That fact that Porter himself, in letters written years later, showed almost no reaction to the Austin murders, no horror, no reflection, no reference to the year of terror that had gripped the city he was living in. Almost like he had nothing to be surprised about. Is O. Henry the servant girl Annihilator? Probably not. The evidence isn't there. But here is the thing: that question matters even if the answer is no, because it means the real answer, the real name, is someone whose name we don't even have as a theory, someone who slipped so completely through the cracks of history that 140 years of research hasn't produced a single credible suspect. We don't know who he was. We have never known. And not knowing across 140 years, it is its own kind of horror. He knew which outbuildings housed servants and which housed tools. He knew which yards had dogs. He knew which nights certain household could be unguarded. He knew the geography of Austin's back alleys and servant paths in a way that suggested he had moved through them many times for ordinary reasons before he used that knowledge for something else. This was not a stranger passing through. This was someone who lived in Austin, worked in Austin, moved through its streets every day, someone whose face was familiar. The shift on Christmas Eve from servant quarters to private homes, from black women to white women, has been interpreted two ways. The first, escalation, a killer who had grown confident, who no longer felt constrained by his particular pattern. The second, adaptation, a killer who knew the city was watching the servants' quarters, who changed his approach to avoid detection. Both interpretations are disturbing because both describe someone thinking clearly, managing risk, strategizing, and then he stopped, and no one ever found out why. I want to stop here because this case risks becoming purely intellectual, a puzzle, a historical curiosity, and that could be wrong. 7 women were murdered in Austin, Texas, over the course of 1 year. Most of them were black women working as domestic servants. Most of them have been largely forgotten, footnotes in a story that became more interesting to later generations as mystery than as a human tragedy. Their names deserve to be said: Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Rebecca Ramey, Mary Ramey, who was 11 years old, Grace Vance, Susan Hancock, Eula Phillips. The near invisibility of most of these women in the historical record is not an accident. It is a consequence of who they were in the social architecture of 1885 Texas. The killer understood that architecture. He chose his victims in the beginning precisely because the system was least likely to protect them, least likely to pursue justice for them, least likely to look hard and seriously at who had done this. That calculation protected him, and that, more than the darkness, more than the acts, more than the mystery of who he was, is the most disturbing element of this entire case. Not the violence, the calculations. The murders were largely forgotten within a generation. Austin grew, the city modernized, the case faded from public memory so completely that by the mid-20th century, most Austinites has never heard of it. It was rediscovered, slowly, incompletely, by historians and true crime researchers, beginning in the 1970s. A few books mentioned it. The O. Henry theory surfaced and recirculated. A podcast series in 2018 brought renewed attention. Nothing broke. The case remains officially unsolved. The servant girl Annihilator killed at least 7 people. He operated for 1 year in plain sight of an entire city. He was never caught and simply stopped. He may have died shortly after. He may have moved to another city or another country and continued. He may have lived a long, quiet, ordinary life in Austin itself, dying in his bed surrounded by people who never knew. We don't know. He won. If O. Henry was innocent, and he probably was, then the servant girl Annihilator was someone whose name we don't even have as a theory. Someone who has slipped so completely through the cracks of history that 140 years of research hasn't produced a single credible suspect. He wasn't just clever enough to stay hidden, he was helped by a system that didn't look hard for him, that treated the death of black women in post-Reconstruction Texas as tragedies, certainly, but not as emergencies that demanded the same resources, the same urgency, the same commitment that the Christmas Eve murders of white women suddenly generated. He built his cover out of that gap, and when the city finally did mobilize, when Austin finally panicked and armed and patrolled, he simply stopped. He adapted. He waited. He survived. There is a question I want to leave you with. Not about O. Henry, not about the Ripper connection, not about forensic or history. Something simpler, something that has sat at the center of this case for 140 years and has never been answered. Why did he stop? Not he was caught, not how he was caught. He wasn't caught. Not what happened to him. We don't know. But why did he stop? Because there are only a few answers. He died. He moved. He was in prison for something else. He was somehow satisfied. He had gotten whatever it was he needed and he was done. Or this is the one that disturbs me most. He stopped because he realized he was safe. Because he looked around at Austin in January 1886 at the panic, the armed patrols, the newspaper outrage, and understood that none of it was going to find him, that he had already won, and that continuing was unnecessary. So tell me this, if you had done something terrible, something that shook an entire city, and you realized no one was even close to finding you, would you be able to stop? Or would the safety itself become the thing that made you want to keep going? Because one of these answers is more frightening than the other, and I think you already know which one. Like and subscribe if you enjoy my story.